Hello friends, and welcome back to RPG A Day 2018. We're here for the topic on day 18, which reads as follows. Art that inspires your game. This is an interesting question. I was reflecting on it for a couple days when I knew I was going to make this video. And of course, there is the traditional fantasy art that you first encounter when you get the game in your own hands and read it for the first time. For me, it was the cover for the D&D Basic Set, the red box by Larry Elmore. The warrior in front of the dragon with just one horn. Look it up, it's just one horn, I realized recently. And the interior art Larry Elmore did for that book, it was very formative. It was my window into D&D. And his subsequent covers for the Expert Set, the Companion, the Masters, and the Immortal Set. Those were all iconic for me, realizing what D&D looked like. There were other artists that worked for TSR which were also very influential in what I envisioned as fantasy, including Clyde Tadwell, Jeff Easley, Brom, Tony DiTerlisi, later artists. I loved the aesthetics for the D&D 3rd edition. I know many of my friends did not, with the weird spiky armor and the strange non-historical shields. They really hated it, but I loved it. I thought it gave the brand its own look. Wayne Reynolds, Todd Lockwood, modern artists like Claudio Posas, who I think is brilliant. These are all artists that really influenced me. I love the art on the Pathfinder books and the Starfinder books, from their first book to the current playtest. I think Paizo does a great job with art and layout for their books. I remember the Rifts books when I started playing role-playing games, and the first time I picked up the Rifts book. Those were all influential. But if I want to go back and think about the art that inspires my game before I became a gamer, before I really knew what role-playing games were, there are three basic influences which I think were formative in my conception of fantasy. Not just what it looks like, but at least in one instance, the topics and what I expected out of fantasy. And those three influences are, first of all, the Brothers Hildebrandt art. Some of you may remember them because of their Lord of the Rings calendars. And I say the calendars that's because that's the first place I saw their art. I loved the Ralph Bakshi animated Lord of the Rings movie, which I saw when I first saw it. And my mother knew how much I love fantasy, even if she wasn't a fan of fantasy or science fiction. I grew up in a household where my mother really did not enjoy science fiction or fantasy, but she encouraged my love for it. So she would get me the Lord of the Rings calendar, wall calendar, every year. So I would have the paintings of the books I had not read yet in my room month after month. I eventually read The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, before I played Dungeons & Dragons. But I discovered the art of the Brothers Hildebrandt through those calendars. They put out a calendar one year. I can't remember the year right now, and I'm not looking it up at this moment. I'll leave a note on the notes for this video. They put out an Atlantis calendar, which was fascinating. It presented a world I had never seen before. It gave me brief vignettes into the destruction of this island and the cultures that were suffering for the end of an era. I found it incredibly fascinating. I kept the calendar for years. I'm sorry I didn't keep it longer. At some point in my teenage years, I got rid of it. It's available online. You can see the images online, so it's not gone from my life. And I think I posted about it once in Stargazer's World. I need to look that up. But that calendar, those images made me dream of a new world. They made me think about what was it that was happening. It fueled my imagination, gave me the desire to tell stories in that world. So that was very formative. That was art that inspired my imagination, not just to recreate the story I had seen in the movie, but to come up with my own stories. And to tie it in with the Lord of the Rings movie, there's another movie by Ralph Bakshi that really influenced me as a young fan of fantasy. And it's Fire and Ice, the movie from 1983. It was a collaboration with Frank Frazetta, and I just loved that movie. This is before you could buy movies. you rented them at the video store. Some of you may not remember. Some of our younger viewers. I must have rented that movie 13, 14 times out of the video club. So the owner must have thought, this kid really likes this movie. And I did. Granted, Fire and Ice tells a story more in the sword and sorcery vein than high fantasy, which is usually what I enjoyed and what I played when I started playing role-playing games. And aesthetics, granted, the heroine is a princess in distress. She's scantily clad. Heroes are bare-chested with their loincloths. And while the aesthetics may not be for everybody, especially I think in our modern age, it may be shocking to some people. I still loved the movie back then. It was seeing this fantasy adventure with warriors fighting beastmen in such a wonderful animated adventure. It just sparked my imagination, despite the fact that the plot's very thin when you see it now as an adult. But my 10-year-old self was really inspired by the art of Fire and Ice, by not just the visuals, but the story it was telling and how the story progressed. The basic plot structure of the movie fueled many of my fantasy-themed games with my action figures. So it was very influential art for me as a young person and what I projected into fantasy role-playing game when I began playing. And the last influence is a comic book I also discovered before role-playing games, and it's ElfQuest by Wendy and Richard Pinney. ElfQuest is a wonderful story, wonderfully drawn, greatly written, about this elf tribe that loses their homeland. They're looking for a new place. And not only was I enthralled by the art, but by the story, the topics it tackled, the ideas it brought forth, the mystery, the fantasy world. It just made me fall in love with elves, more so than The Lord of the Rings. ElfQuest was very influential. It informed me on topics that fantasy can tackle, from brotherhood to love to cultural clashes. It was very, very influential for me, and it's one I often skip when I'm talking about the art that influenced me as a gamer. ElfQuest is available online. According to the website, every ElfQuest tale published before 2014 is free of charge on the ElfQuest site. So there's no reason why you haven't read it. It's wonderful. It's well worth your time. And it's the final of the 3 art influences that really influence and inspire my games before I became a gamer. What's your answer for RPG a Day 2018 Day 18 questions? Say that 3 times quickly. I'd love to know. Leave a message here in the blog. Leave a comment here on the YouTube channel. Look me up on social media. I'd love to chat. Thank you very much, and see you tomorrow.